Well, there's a lot of interest around the state in composting, and there are several different methods. One of the methods of composting is to vermicompost, and that is basically the use of worms to both compost your garbage and improve your soil. And we're at the home of John Blevins today, who is a worm man, and he's going to tell us some of that process. And thanks for letting us come visit, John.
Well, thank you for coming.
So, well, how did you get into growing worms?
Okay, the very interesting part is when I remembered back as a child, my father had told me to grow dirt, not to try to grow flowers or trees or anything else, to grow my dirt, and then I can grow anything in them. And as I experimented with everything, I found that worms create the best compost in the world.
Now, you've actually got quite an operation here where you are creating this environment, and maybe you could explain to the viewers at home a little bit about how this works.
Okay, we're inside a passive solar worm hut, and in here down in the bottom part we have major worm bins. It's a greenhouse which will help heat the worm hut. In the wintertime, I'm able to put all my tropicals, I can raise my seedlings, and one of the great magical things that happened by accident was putting my plants on top of my worm bins. My worms crawled in and out of my plants, fertilizing them, and then also laying eggs and baby worms being in the plants. So in springtime when I put them out, I'm planting a plant as well as planting worms. And we developed a slogan called global warming at that point.
That's pretty good.
Uh-huh.
So now you basically, this is a pit in the ground, and you just feed the worms.
Every organic thing I can find to put in there. At times I'm experimenting with it, but you have all of your basics. In feeding worms, raw vegetable scraps is one of the great things to use for them. I'm now working with the Earth Health Food Deli and Restaurant, and I can take all of their throwaway waste, organic waste, and process it into great earth. And as Fenton said, this is great for everybody. It's a throwaway product for him. It keeps his dumpster from stinking, and it grows rich earth out here, so it's taking throwaway products. Another thing that I use is aged horse manure. So we're in a wonderful situation because it's a throwaway product for the horse farms, and I'm able to process it rather than having it thrown in dumps.
Okay.
Leaves, grass clippings. On the floor of my worm bin down here, it's kind of like regular basements in Oklahoma. They tend to seep a little bit, and so I started throwing down hay and leaves to soak it up. There were some renegade worms that got in the bottom on the floor and created their own worm bed on the floor, so I can feed that floor. After I deplete my other beds, then I can move the floor into the beds and have new worm bins automatically.
Very good. So now that's a larger scale process, but you've actually, you can do this on a smaller scale process, and you've got some examples here.
Yes. You can actually raise worms, and they sometimes do it on breeder worms, on the very small 4-ounce cups. Now, a 4-ounce cup is a container, the earth is a container, but the buffer system on a 4-ounce cup is so small that you would have to check that twice a day. So as you go up, you have more buffer and you can work with it. One of my favorite things are old bathtubs because they're throwaways, plus to me they're kind of aesthetically pleasing. Then we can move down. I have a new smaller one that teachers can actually have on their desk. We like to work with teachers a lot and get them involved in this. Can we do a close-up on this?
Yes.
This is one of the things I like to do. I put a grapefruit in here, half of a grapefruit. I just cut in half and put down so that I can attract the worms in here. I call it a geodesic meeting house for worms because they collect, the rind breaks down slower, and as I pull this up, you can see the hundreds of worms in here eating. Now, one of the neat things is when they're in close proximity is when they're reproducing. So I'm doing two things. I'm feeding them and I'm growing more worms. Now, in a small situation like this, I have to check the dampness. It has to be moist, not wet. On this bin, I do have a total plastic cover, and those are for some people that might be totally afraid of worms, and at night they can put this on there or at their desk. This would have to be opened every day because oxygen is necessary for them. In most of our other bins, we have situations like this one underneath, created by an Edmond high school student, and took an old aquarium, and as you see there's netting across the top because worms will want to crawl when it becomes rainy season and it's dark. since I've had lids on them or have a light on them, then I've never had any real escapees, so you don't have to be afraid of them.
Now, one thing that people might be wondering here is that what does a finished compost look like so that they could go ahead and put it out on their garden?
Okay. Good key on that. Let me show you more of a raw compost. Well, I'll show you 3 examples of a raw compost. This is some aged horse manure raw compost. And of course, in one real sense, this is raw compost.
Right.
And the finished compost, as we see from these bins, looks what most people call coffee ground texture. And look at this, isn't that light and wonderful? And it looks like coffee grounds, and you can tell that it's very finely mixed, and it's just the worm manure that has come out.
Now, that's another question is will there be a smell in this process?
Okay. There should not be any smell unless something is out of balance. And that's kind of the basic process to go with this, is that you want to keep everything in balance. I get questions about how much to feed it. Well, I start with a bin, and I have all my raw materials, and then when I'm adding like vegetables, on a small bin like this, I would take a handful and put it in there, and then I watch it. It's a learning process. And normally it'll take a week at first for that to get processed in a small bin. As it starts churning better and you're getting more worms, you might be able to do that twice a week. If you move up to a larger bin like this, or to my bathtub, you can add a lot more. In my bathtub, I can add 4 5-gallon containers of chopped vegetables, and it will be gone in a week. One of the things I find, especially in the larger ones, you will get roly-polies, and you actually have 50 to 100 different microorganisms working in there. It's not just the worms. Worms are indicators that you have live soil going on, but it's all of the other microorganisms and roly-polies that help the situation. We even, at times, have grub worms in our compost bin. In a compost bin, they're okay because they are simply processing more dirt. Those are things you don't want to transfer to your garden. If you happen to do that, I should mention too, there are some good organic controls of that, and one does not have to use diazinon. So that's a good point to watch. As the different organisms, for example, roly-poly will break down the skin on an apple to get to the mush part so that the worm can work with it. So they're working in harmony.
Now, if someone wanted to do this at home, it's really pretty easy to set up a small worm bin, isn't it? And can you show us how to do that here?
Okay. There's lots of different ways, and again, one I work with is the economy of this situation. Most everything I use here is recycled. One can go out and buy new plastic bins, but if you can find something, be a little creative of what you can work with. The recycling bins that Oklahoma City uses for bottles and things are an excellent one if you have that. But this is a Rubbermaid plastic one. Now, we're using this in a lot of situations because plastic will control the water better than wood will, although wood is a much more natural situation, so that's why we're experimenting with such things as the old ammunition boxes and different things. But for a first-time beginner to learn about them, if you start with a box like this that you buy anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15 gallons, remembering the weight on it will be a factor at some point, the larger it gets. What we do is take this and I take the lid off. I take the lid.
That's the hardest part.
That's the hardest part. And once the lid is off, then the lid is going to become the tray. And this is different than many of the commercial ones you'll buy, and I have nothing against them, but I find that this is a better situation because I can keep track of it better. I will take then my bin and I will make some small drainage holes in it. These are very small holes in here. And this will become the tray to accept the water. So as I'm feeding it, or also remembering if I'm putting a lot of fresh vegetable scraps in there, they have a lot of water in it. So any of the excess water is going to come out on the bottom tray. Then if I can access that into a pitcher, I can use that as liquid fertilizer tea for house plants, outside plants, and it's really a great situation. I can get a big volume of that out of my bathtubs. in this situation, then I will take a little bit of remay and put over each hole because I don't want my worms to escape. Remay being a product you can get at garden centers that's used for row cover crops. It's non-biodegradable, which is good. It was one of those things used earlier on in disposable diapers that caused the big trouble in the dumps because it was non-biodegradable. But for our purposes, it's good. So I can use that. You know, making a worm bin too, it seems funny, but you got to have a lot of fun with this, but it's like making a cake. It's a recipe.
That's true.
And as I add things to it, I'm looking for diversity of different vegetables. I'm looking, for example, citrus I find a lot, and there's a lot written about not using citrus. And I'm not sure of the reasoning on that, except that it is possible that the high use of pesticides on citrus rinds might be some of the thoughts on that. So that's one thing to consider. We'll place these in there. So I wouldn't totally use citrus. I vary it.
Right.
I want a balanced diet for my worms. We have our bin. Then we'll add, I'm going to use some raw compost here and put in there. If you don't have access to this, you can use regular peat moss. All of these materials should be pre-wet and then added to it. Or I can add it and then wet the bin and get it in shape before I add the worms to it. Sometimes dry materials like peat moss are real difficult to get very wet. So I'm going to add this, a little bit of my recipe. Oops.
Now, about how deep do you want to fill this when you are first starting with your compost?
I'm going to take this up to about half full, and that will give me more space to keep adding things to it. One of the interesting things is that the worms are actually processing it and fluffing it, but after a little bit, because of the moisture in it, my bins kept going down, and I wondered why. And I finally figured out it's the same principle as sand and rock and gravel. This, because they make it smaller particles, it's actually going to go down a little bit as opposed to rise. Okay, so now anytime I want to put vegetables into this, again, the smaller sections would be better if I ran them through. Some people use blenders, but I can do this. Sometimes on my table I get a lot of this and I'll make a worm salad, and it's really fun. I mix it up and put it in there. And this I'm putting in there. This is really like the recipe.
It is.
We can do that, and then I could add some more compost to it because I always want all of the vegetables, especially citrus that I add in here, I want covered. And because it's covered, then gnats and flies aren't as big a problem, or they're not a problem. I don't have any problem with it. Okay, now another great ingredient is paper. You can use newspaper, or you can use cardboard. You can use paper towels or anything like that. On a newspaper situation, you can use the funny papers because colored ink is soybean based, and that's fine. The carbon ink is okay. I spent as much time as I could calling everybody, and I have found that there isn't a great problem in that. The only thing you don't want to use is the colored slick paper, advertising paper. There's something in the paper itself. So you can add that to it. Get it good and damp by, on this situation I'm going to add the water here. If you have a little hand mister after you get everything wet, you can use it if you need to add water. And then I'm going to let it soak. If I do this a day ahead of time, it's really better because for the materials to get fully wet, then when you inject the worms in it, it works great. And from then on, after you have the starter going, you can add your vegetables, your newspaper to it. The general rule is to start with a good handful in there, wait till it disappears, or mostly disappeared, and then add some more.
Okay. Now, the one last question here is, how many worms would you need in a container this size?
Okay. It's always hard to tell. I would say anywhere from 500 to 1,000.
Okay.
And it's like I raise worms also in my buckets. And everybody asks me how many worms in my bucket, and I never know. They're 500 to say. As important are the worm eggs that are in there. So sometimes when you get that, if you mail order worms, usually 1 pound is enough to start a small one with. And I think I mentioned it earlier, but one of the great things we have to do so that you don't have to learn the lesson I did is to take your remay and put it on the top. And this is great for me too, because I can tell if my bin's out of order because there'll be an odor coming out of it, and it shouldn't be there. And of course I don't want to leave it just loose. I will make this great rubber band wrapping on it, and you would keep it taut like that. This is also good if I want to come in with a sprayer and kind of spray it. The idea of keeping these under the sink will work, but you have limited oxygen supply.
Right.
I really think people ought to make a space and have this out and it be part of their kitchen situation. In spring and summertime, this can be outside, but not in direct light. You have to watch the temperature. I had mentioned that. We're speaking of ground temperatures, but you want it between 60 and 70 if possible. They work best. If it goes over 85, you're probably going to kill your worms. If it goes below 32, it can go way down. They're just not working it very much at that time.
So, well, we really appreciate you showing us how to set up our own composting bin, and thank you also for showing us around your worm farm.
Okay, you're welcome.
We hope you've enjoyed this classic from the Oklahoma Gardening Vault. Remember, even though these tips and techniques are timeless, there's always something new to learn in the world of gardening. By subscribing to both Oklahoma Gardening and OK Gardening Classics, you'll have access to a wealth of gardening knowledge, both classic and contemporary.